Guru Nation, welcome back to another episode of Random Musings from the Clinical Trials Guru, episode 135, if you can see it here, for the podcast, and probably going on YouTube too, but it's podcast first. This is kind of new for 2018. Don't worry, YouTube, we still got tons of stuff for you every day, but podcast is like where I can go in depth and just spend a lot of time on, because people's attention spans on the podcast are a lot longer than they are on YouTube. I'm no different when I consume content. I listen to podcasts way more than I watch a YouTube video. So I can get into some, I guess I could go further down or deeper down rabbit holes in this industry. So this is one of those rabbit holes I'm going to get into. It's all about SMOs, site management organizations, and for anyone interested in opening a research clinic, it's very tempting to want to start a network of sites, and it's very possible for you to do that. I've done that, and it almost happened by accident. Initially, it was planned, and then I kind of went back to the basics, focusing on one or two sites, and then just kind of evolved thanks to social media, actually. But for everyone, it's going to be different. There's going to be different ways for you to network, different ways for you to grow your site network, if that's something you want to do. And by the way, I don't think it's something you should or shouldn't do. I think everyone needs to make that decision. Anyone who's starting a site or owns a site needs to make that decision for themselves on what makes the most sense for them, right? Do you want to expand, or do you just want to focus on one site? Only you can answer that, right? There's obviously pros and cons to both of those two alternatives. So SMOs fell out of favor with sponsors probably mid 2000s, like from 06, definitely from 08. Let's just call it like the recession of 08. I think the SMOs kind of fell out of favor around that time. And it looks like they might be making a comeback. SMOs are, and I think a lot of that has to do with supply and demand. I constantly talk about supply and demand because it's a simple concept, but it helps explain a lot. So right now in 2018, there's a lot of studies. There's a huge supply of studies. This should be a record year for clinical research studies in the United States, probably worldwide too, but let's just talk about the United States right now. And sponsors at the same time are, or need to, and as a result are taking more control of their studies. So yes, they're still using CROs. You can't escape the CROs. Mine is one of them, a very small one. But you can't escape the IQVIAs. I still can't get over that name. I still refer to them as quintiles, or the INC Research, which changed its name to Syneos or something like that. It's going to be hard for me to remember these names now that I'm not day to day in the trenches filling out feasibility surveys. I know these CROs by their previous names. So they're not going anywhere this year, next year, the following year. At this point, nobody knows what the future holds for these big CROs, but you can speculate. And I've talked to many in the industry, many higher ups, people that are way more connected than I am. By the way, I'm not that connected in the industry. But I guess I'm connected to the people that are connected. That'd be a good way to put it. So I talk to them all the time. And they tell me, privately, some would say it in a podcast or an interview, maybe. I will try to get that out of them. I'll try to extract that out of my future interview guests. But it looks like the smart money is betting on sponsors getting more involved in their studies, which means they will no longer, and this is in theory, okay, They will no longer, in theory, need a big quintiles or INC to run their study, because after the 2016 GCP revisions, the FDA mandated that sponsors take more initiative over their studies and have more oversight over their studies. They can no longer outsource everything to a CRO and then claim no responsibility when something happens, like an audit occurs. The FDA said, no more of that. Just like PIs are expected to have oversight of their sites, regardless of who's on the delegation of duties log, you, sponsor, are going to take full responsibility of the study, regardless of what CRO you outsource to. So in theory, it looks like the sponsors, since they have to have more oversight anyways, that means they got to spend more of their own resources to handle some of these studies. The argument is, why would they even need a big CRO anymore? You would actually need a niche CRO like, I don't know, mine, right? To handle just some ground hand-to-hand combat type of activities, like selecting sites for very niche studies, or maybe just doing interim monitoring visits and not doing feasibility surveys, or just doing remote and risk-based monitoring and not worrying about SIVs, or not worrying about contracts and budget negotiation with sites, or not worried about site selection, or vice versa. Maybe just do site selection and not all the other things I mentioned. Every sponsor is different. They can do whatever they want. But the cookie cutter approach of, here's a CRO, let them do everything for you, and you just kick your feet up and go do something else, is looking like something that is history. Right? That's something that's, at least in theory, going away. Much too early. Things in this industry move slowly. And of course, all of this is subject to change, and it's just one person's commentary on other people's theories. It's not even really my theory, although I guess I've kind of adopted it because it makes sense to me. So, CROs, big CROs, are no longer, well, at least in theory again, if CROs, big CROs, are no longer going to be in favor with sponsors, SMOs could be in favor again. So the reason the SMOs, the site management organizations, went out of favor with the pharma companies in the mid-2000s, probably early to mid-2000s, and then it lasted for just until recently, until this year, is because there was a lot of mergers, acquisitions, consolidations. The SMOs were growing really quickly. They learned that there was a lot of money to be made, and quality took a hit. Quality took a backseat to growth. And FDA audited some studies that some SMOs were a part of, and sponsors got scared of using SMOs, to the point where on the feasibility surveys, if you put that you're part of an SMO in the past, you probably weren't getting that study. That's starting to change. And again, just a theory. As of April 4th, 2018, this could very well be not the case in April 4th, 2020. But it's a theory. The SMOs are coming back in style. And by the way, SMOs never really left. They just changed their strategy. They changed their marketing approach. I know many sites the past decade, many entrepreneurs in this space that were running SMOs without calling themselves SMOs. So what you had was a bunch of loose alliances of sites that partner together. They have different names, but they share infrastructure, they pool resources, they basically exchange studies with one another, and sometimes pretty formal, other than each is its own entity, right? Each site is its own entity, as opposed to an SMO, which was one entity and then it controlled a bunch of sites. So the SMO business model never really left. It just kind of morphed into site networks, site alliances. And naturally, I mean, the money's still there. If you open a research clinic, you can make 6 figures a year for yourself with just 2 studies, even 1 study if it's the right study. So when you start talking about doing 10, 15 studies a year per site, you can see how the money starts to pile up. And it's no wonder people are incentivized to want to think about expanding and furthering their market share. Now, I take calls almost every day from people who want to open up sites, whether they're CRAs that want to open up a site or existing sites that want to expand. Be very careful about expanding too quickly. So if you start one site and you have never had experience running a site, you should probably work on getting that site proficient and building the infrastructure so that you can scale later, right? Then you can expand, maybe in year 2 or year 3, expand on your second and third and fourth sites. But don't do that from the beginning. Don't do that from day one. You need to focus on one site, one PI, one study, and then bring on a second study and bring on a third study and figure out what works for that site, and then repeat that model, or grow that site and then maintain that site, right? So I'm not encouraging anyone to expand. I'm just letting you know it's an option. Obviously, a lot of people listening, watching, a lot of people I'm having conversations with in the industry are considering, or at least aware of, the fact that they can expand. And they always ask me, well, what's better? And the answer is, I don't know what's better. Everything's like, one thing can work well for me and it may not work well for you, or vice versa. You have to figure out what works best. There's pros and cons to having one site versus having a dozen sites versus having a dozen sites each its own entity, right? So let me break down those 3 different options, and then there's a lot of subcomponents to it. So let's see how long we can go with this podcast. But basically, let's go with one site. No matter what you want to do, you need to start with one site, okay? Then you got to start with one PI, one study, build it out. It's probably going to take you a year to start getting profitable and making money that matters, meaning a livable wage that you can start paying yourself. Maybe a little less than a year. It could be 6 months if you really know what you're doing and you're getting lucky. But please do not start with 3 sites at the same time when you have no experience and don't know what you're doing. So start with one site. You can start with multiple PIs, but keep it under one roof, okay? Once you do that, let's say you get to year 1 and now you're making 60, 80, 100K a year that you're paying yourself now. You're profiting that. You're putting that into your pocket after you pay your PI, after you pay your employees, after you pay the rent and the overhead. That's where you're taking home. Now you have the choice of continuing to build your site. Now look at profits, okay? Just so when you hire more staff, profits go down unless you can bring in and maintain and continue to have quality assurance more business, right? So it's not just about hiring employees, because your profits go down. Once you hire your first, second, third employee, profit margins go down unless you can grow faster than what you're spending, which is not, it's very easy to spend money. It's quite difficult to increase and earn money and maintain profit margins when you're increasing spending, right? So figure out what works for your site with your infrastructure. How many PIs do you need? How many coordinators do you need? What other staff do you need in place? What are your margins? What are the alternatives? Let's say you do, instead of 15 studies where you're profiting, let's say 60% profit margins, maybe you can go to 12 studies or 10 studies and profit 80%. Okay, so sometimes it may be better if you can do less studies. Now, again, every year and every study is different because every study pays a different budget. Every study is not going to recruit the same for you. So you may do really well at recruiting for one type of study, but then you get another type of study and you're not making money on it, but you're still spending resources on it. So it's a balancing act. You got to figure out what works for that site. Once you find that sweet spot, and it can pretty much run itself. And by the way, it's never going to run itself, but you'll always need some involvement. But you need a manager in place. You need QA in place. You need to constantly keep the biz dev going, which is why a lot of sites hire my consulting company, because we do all of this for you for $1,000 a month, month to month, and no contract. Once you hit that spot where you can now allocate some of your time to expanding, you need to think, okay, do I need to bring more studies to my current site and raise the top line while keeping the profits the same? Or would it be better for me to open another clinic 2 in a different city, maybe 10 miles away, 15 miles away, 20 miles away, maybe 2,000 miles away? I don't know, whatever works for you. And if that's the case, should you keep the same LLC for site 2, for clinic 2? Or should you create a new LLC or a new corporation for that site? And the answer is, I don't know. What I've done is I've created new LLCs or S corps, because I'm no tax attorney. I'm no consult with your CPA, tax attorneys, to figure out what works best for you. Every state's different. Your tax situation's different than mine. Figure out what works best for you with professionals, right? Figure out what would make sense. But for me, what's made sense, not so much from a tax perspective, but from a just overall strategy, and mainly because I was afraid of the SMO, of the perception that I would be considered an SMO if I had 12 sites with the same name all over the country. I wanted to create small sites. So I have a dozen or so sites now that I own or partner with. So own, loose term, I may own a small percentage in each one, but a dozen or so across the country, each doing any year from 2 to 12 studies a year. Okay, I found that that's the sweet spot for me and for my sites, because profit margins are high because you only need a couple of employees. Okay, and as long as you're getting the right studies, you can get the patients in there and you can get the revenues up and keep margins down. All right, now, the reason I chose separate LLC entities for each site, again, I was afraid of being considered an SMO, but not only that, each site allows me to give equity, ownership, to a coordinator maybe at that site, or a site director at that site, or a PI at another site, so that I don't have to manage and run around like a madman all these sites across the country. I could focus on my day-to-day activities, which is running my consulting company, my CRA academy, the 2 sites where I'm actually actively involved in, and it might be a 3rd site pretty soon, my CRO. Like, there's a lot. The last thing I need to worry about is managing a dozen sites on top of all of this. It wouldn't work. So that's why I decided, and I knew that when I started expanding back in 2010, right? Now, prior to 2010, when I was not a public figure, at least in the industry, a public figure, I did have 3 sites in Southern California, all using the same name. And it worked well. And I guess I wasn't afraid of being considered an SMO back then. And I remember getting asked by sponsors, you have 3 sites, are you an SMO? They're all called the same name. It was called South Coast Clinical Trials. They're all the same name. Are you an SMO? I said, no. Each site has its own PI, has its own staff, has its own SOPs. and they do their own regulatory documents. We just control the contract. So rather than negotiating one contract with each site, you can negotiate one contract and we will use the same contract and budget for every site. So in theory and on paper, that's an SMO. But in branding and marketing, because I knew SMOs had a bad reputation, it was not an SMO. Once I became more public facing and I started getting inbound inquiries from people that want to open up sites in cities I've never even been to, I decided to pivot, and I decided to change each site into its own entity. And by doing that, I actually raised profit margins, but I diluted my ownership. So one site where I used to pay employees, now I give them some of my equity and they work for free, but they make profits. They actually make more than they did when I was paying them. But what the benefit for me is now I have some incentive for them to manage the site, so I don't need to do that. That creates some time for me to do other things like continue to grow, continue to build. And it reduces costs to almost nothing, right? Because there's no more salary anymore. The highest cost in this industry is salary. So I made the PI and the coordinator part owners at this one site, and then something kind of clicked and said, hey, this is something that I can scale. First of all, there's very little risk because I'm no longer just throwing money at salaries. I'm making everyone an owner. Yes, I'm making less because instead of now owning 100% of a site, I'm now owning like 25, 33%. But I don't have to pay salaries anymore, and I don't really have to be as involved anymore. So that means I can do this again and again and again in different markets, and that's what we've been doing. So I guess under that model, we kind of operate as an alliance of sites because the sites that I'm an owner of, we share leads with each other, and we do share resources. They're their own independent entities, but we do share resources, like, for example, training resources, right? We have our CRA Academy, which is an excellent research naive training program for anybody who wants to be a coordinator, CRA, whatever they want to be. So when a new employee comes in at one of my sites, we put them through the CRA Academy. They don't have to pay because they're part of our network of sites. So that's worked well for me, and I guess that's been an alliance. Now, could it have worked just as well? Maybe I could have made even more money if I kept just one company, paid the salaries, right? Profits would have initially been lower, but eventually I would have, because I own 100% of it, I would have had more money, right? That's just not the strategy I wanted to go with, right? For a couple of reasons: the SMO having a bad reputation, and the upfront costs, and the fact that I could no longer leverage my time, because you can never expect someone who's not an owner of a company to care as much about that company as you do. So if you give up some of your equity, they will take ownership, and that will allow you to do other things like continue to expand. But both models can work, and now I guess what I'm trying to get at is, if you want to use the model of having one LLC operate a bunch of sites across the country, the SMO thing, at least in theory, is they no longer have as bad of a reputation. Matter of fact, some sponsors are looking at SMOs because the lines kind of get blurry when you're talking about an SMO and a CRO. Like, some SMOs have their own QA systems in place, and they have their own internal monitors that go quality assure at each site before that real monitors come from the CRO. So and sponsors know this, so they say, well, why do I need to use a CRO when I can use an SMO? They're already maintaining QA, and we can just send our CRAs every 6 to 8 weeks to do monitoring visits. So SMOs might be coming back. There really is no right or wrong way to do this. Just wanted to outline some of the options for you, some of the pros and cons, and hopefully you learned a thing or two, or maybe not. It's okay. Don't bite off more than you can chew. Start with one site. Don't think about expanding too quickly. Think about raising profits until it no longer makes sense to bring in more studies at one site. And then think about expanding. Talk to you soon, Guru Nation. Take care. Appreciate it.